My name is Jamais Cascio. I am a professional futurist. I've been doing it for about 20 years now. I operate primarily with the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, California, which is a 40-odd-year-old nonprofit futurist group. But I do a lot of independent stuff. I write and I give talks, and I am generally just trying to be a smart guy out there in the world. So the talk that I gave at the opening of the ADC Forum, the Future Summit for the ADC Forum, was entitled An Optimist's Guide to the Next 10 Years and had as a front page illustration a massive asteroid hitting the Earth. I really was talking about what I was referring to as a metaphorical swarm of asteroids that are headed our way. They were stranded assets, so basically things like carbon, coal, oil, the kinds of resources that we put enormous amounts of money into that will in a very short amount of time become valueless, or effectively valueless. Because when you look at things like unburnable carbon, it turns out that in the OECD Pacific region, 93% of the coal that remains of known reserves can't be burned if we want to remain within the 2 degree Celsius threshold. And so I actually started out, and this is a fun story, I started out talking about guano, because guano, basically bat and bird poop, was in the 19th century a critical global resource. It was, because it can function as a very high quality fertilizer, guano was the subject of wars, literally, between Chile and Argentina. And there was the 1856 Guano Island Act in the United States, which basically gave any US citizen who stumbled across an island that had supplies of guano that was otherwise unclaimed, with a very loose definition of unclaimed. These islands would now be part of the United States, as long as the guano was sold only as long as guano was only sold within the United States. So think about that. There were at the time hundreds of these guano islands. There was millions of dollars invested, and in the late 19th century, this was the beginning of industrial agriculture. In 1909, Fritz Haber invented what's now known as the Haber-Bosch process of nitrogen fixation, basically allowing the creation of artificial fertilizer. And the value of guano went from extraordinary to essentially poop overnight. And so that is the classic example of stranded assets. Here you have lots of money, lots of value, political value being put into a particular resource that, because of, in this case, a technological innovation, that resource shifted to essentially being of zero value. We see a similar kind of issue these days around pesticides and the number of different kinds of pesticides that are being outlawed because of environmental toxicity, specifically around bee colony collapse disorder. Millions of dollars being put into industrial agriculture, millions of dollars being put into the development and deployment of these pesticides, valueless. And of course then carbon, coal, oil, etc. So that was the first big asteroid that's headed your way. The second was around the blockchain architecture, encryption and the like. Bitcoin is the sort of prime example, and most people think, if they know about Bitcoin and they're not sort of tech heads, they probably know about it in terms of being a currency for use in the darknet, Silk Road and Agora, all these different sites if you want to buy counterfeits or drugs or weapons. But the blockchain architecture is more than that, and there's some really interesting work being done at Ethereum, at IBM, about the deployment of smart contracts, which will essentially translate the legalese of a contract into algorithm, a self-executing algorithm. And so there's some interesting implications around contract incorporation, micropayments, distributed micropayments that might actually work this time. There is a lot of potential for blockchain architecture, Bitcoin, and related technologies to be very disruptive. Of the 5 asteroids I talk about, that's the one that's probably the shakiest. The third is the end of advertising. And that's actually something that at the Institute for the Future we've been talking a lot about recently. Because for a variety of reasons, the different kinds of advertising media are showing less and less utility, being less and less effective. If you think about the DVR, the digital video recorder, its main value is, as claimed, to be able to record something from television and watch it at your leisure. but its main value for the user is to be able to jump over commercials. To the degree that when the DVR was first deployed, you had television executives saying that skipping commercials was theft. So you think about the kinds of things we've been hearing more recently about, using an ad blocker is theft. You're stealing the website. Well, it's the same kind of thing, same kind of noise we've been hearing for a couple of decades now. And ad blockers are become extremely valuable as a way of defending yourself, not just from intrusive advertising, but from the malware that's increasingly using advertising on the web as a vector. It used to be that mobile devices were the last bastion of powerful advertising. But with the release last week of Apple iOS 9, that includes content blocking as an option, suddenly ad blockers work on your phone. And that was the last straw. So we're seeing the collapse of the advertising industry based on eyeballs. And there isn't a good replacement yet. So that's going to have enormous implications for businesses. The fourth was digital equals hackable. And we all are familiar with things like viruses embedded in digital picture frames, or you can hack your car and all those things like that. I'm actually talking more about the kinds of social and economic hacking that can take place because of the expanded use of digital technologies. So, for example, when the Free Syrian Army hacked the Associated Press Twitter feed, that actually resulted in a brief crash of the stock market in the United States because it sent out a fake news story about a bombing of the White House. And what you have taking place in stock markets these days are what's called high-frequency trading, algorithmic trading, where software makes all the decisions around trading of stocks, and does so on the basis of following the most recent, the latest news. So it can act, so that one application can act faster than another. And so with the Twitter feed for Associated Press being taken, what that actually led to was an opportunity to make money by shorting the stock. So we know that somebody made money from sending out this fake Twitter blast on the Associated Press name. We can see the same kind of thing emerging, or the similar kind of thing emerging around 3D printing. The emergence of intellectual property issues, the ability to break existing laws. When Defense Distributed released designs for a firearm, a 3D printable firearm, and that one that works can be printed with a decent, $500 or so 3D printer, every single gun control law in the world became obsolete. And so these are the kinds of disruptions we're seeing. It's not just the getting in and breaking passwords, it's getting in and doing things that affect society. And that's becoming easier as more and more of the physical world becomes a digital world. And lastly is the issue around the transformation of labor. And that takes place in a number of different ways. It has a number of different manifestations. There's the gig economy, things like Uber or TaskRabbit, where people who are looking for work end up doing these kinds of moment-by-moment task-based jobs that don't have a future necessarily, but allow for a somewhat reliable, somewhat steady stream of income. The problem is that these kinds of jobs are easily swapped out for somebody else, somebody who works cheaper, somebody who can work with software instead. As an example, Uber already announcing that they're planning on purchasing something like 20,000 self-driving cars in order to essentially get rid of their drivers. So there's that. There's all the stuff around what I've been calling semi-automated or semi-automatic labor. And that's where, a perfect example here is like a self-checkout system. So it's not just a machine replacing a human worker, it's a machine plus the customer. It's a semi-automatic system because it requires the customer to replace some of the labor from the worker. And we're seeing that all pop up all over the place, these kinds of systems that essentially rely on the end user to supply the kinds of things that a robot or a computer can't yet do easily. There was a really scary data point from the recession in the United States, for the most recent big recession. 2/3 of the jobs that were lost in 2008, 2009 paid more than $65,000 a year. So we're good, strong, middle-class incomes. Over 2/3 of the jobs that have come back in the, since 2012 have made under $35,000 a year. So basically, yes, there's been an increase in employment, but it's not been in quality jobs. It's been in these kinds of gig jobs, easily replaceable jobs, jobs that don't have a future. So we see a big dilemma here because of the rise of automation, because of these, whether we're talking about automated or semi-automated jobs, because of the shift in priorities around gig jobs. There is a very real problem with how you maintain a society of people having a livable wage, people having a livable lifestyle when you don't have reliable labor, don't have reliable jobs for your labor. So one of the conclusions that I've come to in my thinking about these issues is a realization that of the different human qualities that machines are able to replicate, the thing that's going to be the most difficult to replicate is empathy, emotional intelligence. And when you have a robot that can comfort a crying kindergartner, you've hit the singularity and all bets are off. In the meantime, it's going to be a lot easier to replace a university professor than a kindergarten teacher. It's going to be a lot easier to replace a surgeon than a nurse. It's easier to replace a clothing designer than a hairdresser. And one thing that you'll notice about all these different kinds of jobs is they are traditionally performed by women. They're so-called pink-collar jobs. So the kinds of jobs that have been considered to be less critical by conventional values and therefore done by women. And if those are the jobs that are persistent, those are the jobs that will be the most difficult to replace, that leads to all sorts of questions about the nature of labor as we move forward in the next decade, 20 years. Do we have men taking on these jobs because of the traditional values of male labor, head of household? Do we have a shift in the perceived value of these jobs? Is there greater emphasis on the trying to figure out how to automate these kinds of jobs? It's a really big and I think important question that hasn't yet been given enough consideration. In how do we deal with a world where the kinds of jobs that have historically been good, strong, middle-class jobs are increasingly easy to automate or part out into these gigs. And the kinds of jobs that persist are the ones that have historically not been given respect. So that's what I talk about.